In our third part of Jimmy Hoffa, we will discuss the Kennedy assassination and the possibility that Jimmy Hoffa was either involved in it or had prior knowledge of it. This and more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Well, what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting. Well, hello and welcome to this edition of Charlie Crimebuster. Hey, for the past 2 weeks, we've been discussing the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa. Now, if you missed any of these, go to charliecrimebuster.com and you can get caught up with part 1 and part 2 of the mystery. We'll include that link in the show notes. Now, you're going to find out a lot of stuff, including who killed him and where his body might be. Now, today we're going to take a wild ride as we discuss the Kennedy assassination and the possibility that the mob was involved, connecting it all the way to Jimmy Hoffa. Now, before we get into that, let me say thank you if you're a regular listener, or especially if you're a first-time listener to the podcast. Thank you, especially for your support. Some of you have now become badge sponsors. There, for as little as $3 a month, you can help us in our mission of supporting the nation's heroes. Go to peacemakernetwork.com. There you're going to find a platform where we support law enforcement, first responders, and the military. So please do take a moment, go to peacemakernetwork.com. Again, we'll have that link in the show notes. You see, now more than ever, law enforcement and our other heroes, they need our help. Hope you'll join us. Now, in our past episodes, we have acquainted you with the tension between Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa. The McClellan hearings in Congress, well, they began to investigate labor and the influence of organized crime. And our friend Jimmy Hoffa, yep, he was in the center of it all. You see, while many of the leaders of organized crime, well, they could plead the Fifth Amendment. They could refuse to answer questions from the committee. You see, Jimmy Hoffa, though, as president of the Teamsters Union, well, he did not have that luxury. You see, it would not be good for the president of the Teamsters to plead the Fifth Amendment. So he was fair game for the questions from the committee. And get this, serving on that committee was a young senator by the name of Robert Kennedy. And his brother, Bobby Kennedy, well, he was the legal counsel. That was the guy doing the questioning on the panel, and believe me, boy, sparks flew between Kennedy and Hoffa. And Hoffa, well, he gave as good as he got, but my friend, it was explosive TV. Now, interesting enough, the Kennedy brothers were not that well known at this time in history. In fact, you could say that Jimmy Hoffa, through this hearing, well, that was published on TV, one of the first of such type of hearings to be seen on public TV, well, you could say that Hoffa was responsible for shining the spotlight on the Kennedys. And that, no doubt, went a long way in helping John Kennedy get known in the nation and then go on to become the President of the United States. Now, Jimmy Hoffa, he did become, no doubt, the nemesis of both Kennedys. And you better believe both of them had made threats, public statements about Hoffa. And Hoffa, well, he would return the public attacks. And this social legal war, well, it included wiretapping and even planting spies in each other's parts. And that, my friend, was by both of them. Now, this hatred continued after Kennedy was elected president. He was elected president over Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was then the vice president to Eisenhower. And this election, well, it was won by the most narrowest votes in the history of the presidency at that time. You see, as president, John Kennedy appointed his own brother, Bobby Kennedy, Now, as the Attorney General, not just a legal counsel and a committee questioning them, he's now the lead law enforcement officer in the nation. He's the Attorney General. And you better believe it, Bobby continued his crusade against Hoffa and organized crime. He even appointed his own so-called Get Hoffa squad of investigators. Yes, my friend, he was coming after Hoffa with the force of a hurricane, and that was along with the support and backing of the President of the United States. Now, my question is, could this be a motive to kill the President of the United States? But wait a minute, there's even more, and we're going to find out what that more is. But right now, it's time for what we call our Crazy Crook Story of the Week. Now, our Crazy Crook Story this week comes to us from Restview, Florida, and it is another doozy. You see, it appears that, Florida deputies, they used a taser to stop a man who tried to avoid arrest. He tried to avoid arrest, but now, wait a minute, wait for it. He attempted to avoid arrest by fleeing on a riding lawnmower. Yes, sir, buddy, a riding lawnmower. You see, on Saturday, the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office said it was trying to serve arrest warrants on a 40-year-old man, and they found him on a mower in the backyard. They shouted at him to stop, to get on the ground, but then our crazy crook, he had the bright idea to elude police and tried to escape on a riding lawnmower. Well, deputies chased him. Guess they did not have any lawnmower stop sticks, so they used the taser. And finally, the pursuit ended. Now, we do not know how many blades of grass lost their life in this chase. But we do know that this man, this crazy crook, was taken into custody. And surprise, surprise, when he was finally caught, deputies found him with drugs. That could have added to this crazy idea to outrun the police on a mower. But he was also found with a handgun, a revolver, a handcuff key, and drug paraphernalia. Now, he is facing charges on grand theft of a vehicle. Maybe he should have stuck with a vehicle for his attempts to escape instead of a riding lawnmower. But they also charge him with felony criminal mischief, 2 counts of resisting an officer, possession of a concealed weapon by a convicted felon, carrying a concealed handcuff key, and possession of drug paraphernalia and drugs, felony failure, other accounts. So, my friend, I guess the moral of this, if you're carrying an illegal gun, and you have a concealed handcuff key and drugs, well, it's probably best not to try to flee on a lawnmower. You see, I think they're going to win that pursuit every time. And that, my friend, is Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Now back to our main focus. Well, the fuse is lit. The crusade is on to get Jimmy Hoffa. But first, let's go back to just before the election. You see, the Kennedy family itself, they had some skeletons lurking back in the closet. Joe Kennedy, the Kennedy's father, who had bought himself into an ambassadorship with his tremendous wealth, it seems that he did not make money the old-fashioned way. That is, unless you consider crime to be the old-fashioned way. You see, he made his millions, much of it during the Prohibition, selling bootleg whiskey. And in order to do that, on the level he did it, he had to have his own collusion with the mob bosses of his day. And Joseph Kennedy, knowing that his past would limit his own pursuit of higher office, he then put his efforts and vast financial support into getting his son, John F. Kennedy, elected into office. As a father, he appealed for support from some of his old mob acquaintances. And the mob reportedly was instrumental in John Kennedy winning 3 vital states. They contributed in a contest that was won by less than 100,000 votes. And it was the understanding from the mob's point of view that old Joe Kennedy, well, he had committed he would have his sons, John and Bobby, stay away from their pursuit of organized crime. That was the deal. But this deal, well, however, after the election, that did not happen. Bobby, with the support of the president, continued his pursuit with his Get Hoffa squad. And it did not help that during this time, Joseph Kennedy, the father, well, he suffered a stroke, a major stroke, which no doubt hindered any influence that he could render to use his sons on behalf of organized crime. And the crime bosses, they were livid. They had livid that they had, quote, worked their butts off to help elect Kennedy, only to be ignored and then pursued by mob investigators. And yet there's yet another reason. Another reason why the mob may have felt betrayed by the Kennedys. You see, when Castro took over Cuba, well, he kicked out the mob bosses out of Cuba, closed down their casinos. You see, they were well on their way to develop Cuba to be a rival Las Vegas in the gambling business. Millions of dollars were at stake. So when the CIA, note government, needed help in getting rid of old Castro, well, incredibly, they actually turned to the mob for help. There were even plans to assassinate Castro with the help of the mob. And this was the same time when the infamous Bay of Pigs came into play. You see, while the CIA was training exiled Cubans to go back to take over their country, it is now well known that the mob was instrumental in helping to arm the invasion and train these exiles. You see, the mob, they had a whole lot to gain with getting Castro out of Cuba. But that invasion failed, and many Cubans, people in the CIA, and especially the mob leaders, well, they all blamed President Kennedy, for not doing more to support that invasion. Especially his decision not to use our air power, to help these men on that beach. And that was considered one of the main reasons the invasion failed. Well, by this time, you can now be certain that the Kennedys were not very well liked by the mob. In fact, you can be assured he was hated by many of these mob leaders. But was this enough? Was this enough, one, to think that the mob and Jimmy Hoffa had anything to do with the assassination of the president? It was on November the 22nd, 1963, that shots rang out in Dallas, Texas, and the 35th president of the United States was killed. He was the youngest president elected and the youngest president to die. Now, in order to link anyone else, a mob, or anybody else actually, to this assassination of the president, well, you would first have to disapprove the act of one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, as the sole murderer of the president. And, in fact, the Warren Commission, a commission that was appointed by then President Johnson to study the assassination, well, that Warren Commission had ruled that Oswald, that he acted alone in the shooting and killing of the president, with no connection to others. There was not, according to the Warren Commission, a conspiracy. Case settled, right? Well, not quite. You see, because while there was support for the Warren Commission, there was support against the Warren Commission. That report that they made was made public. And literally thousands of the documents that the investigation had produced, thousands of those documents, now get this, even though the report was made, well, those documents were withheld from the public. And you have to ask the question, why? Why not tell the public all about the investigation into the killing of our president? Well, that information that was withheld, it could, my friend, have caused a lot of people to question the results of the Warren Commission, including, but not limited to, the possibility that the mob was involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. Now, what was that information? Well, we're going to share some of that in a moment. But right now, it is time for what we call our Courageous Citizen of the Week story. Now, this past July the 7th, there were 3 men, one who was armed with a gun. They entered an occupied home in Escambia County, Florida. Well, a homeowner, they pulled a handgun to defend himself. But in the excitement of the moment, well, he dropped it. He then ran and got an AK-47 style gun from somewhere else in the residence. And one of those suspects, well, they picked up the weapon that the homeowner had dropped. But then the homeowner, this courageous man, opened fire on the home invasion suspects while they were still in his home. It actually appears he hit one of the suspects. And all of them, well, they fled from the scene. You see, a homeowner with an AK-47 type rifle, he'll get your attention, right? And the sheriff there in Escambia County, well, he said no charges will be filed against the homeowner. And Sheriff Simmons, well, he says that this guy started shooting for his own protection, to get them out of the house, to protect himself. And Sheriff goes on to say, and I love this, he went on to say, homeowners protecting themselves in Florida, in Escambia County, well, you can protect yourself. You see, my friend, the problem of many people who want to ban guns totally in this country, well, they appear not to understand that the criminals, well, they're still going to have guns. You see, they have no regard for the law, and homeowners like this one without guns, they would not be able to protect themselves. So this homeowner who protected his home in a home invasion, my friend, he is indeed our Charlie Crimebuster, Courageous Citizen of the Week. Now back to our main focus. Was Lee Harvey Oswald the sole shooter in the killing of America's favorite and the world's favorite president? My friend, there's so much material about the assassination that we could not possibly go through it in one podcast, or even 100 like-minded podcasts. But let me share some of the information that's very worthy of our time on today's topic. First, the doctors and those who worked on the body of the president. And my friend, this includes not only the surgeons that worked on his body there at Parkland Hospital, but even the president's own personal physician who was with him all the time. Well, he was present there at Parkland, and he was also present at the autopsy of the president. He, along with those surgeons, both said one lone gunman shooting from the rear of the president could not make the wounds they saw on the president. There was, among other evidence, a large gaping exit wound in the back of the president's head that proved there was more than one shooter that was involved. And get this, over 50 witnesses reported that gunfire came from other areas that day. Now those witnesses, they included a chief of police, a sheriff, a Secret Service agent, and people in the motorcade, many of them who had combat experience from the military. They all reported shots coming from other areas. And get this, that doctor, well, he first testified and said to others that it was exit wounds. Well, he was pressured on the very night of the autopsy by an agent of the Secret Service to back off his story. And the agent who put that pressure on him, well, he reported later that he was ordered to do so, and now that he had regretted his actions to try to change the narrative of the doctor. Now add to this, a very easy confirmation about this could have been made with an examination, a new examination of the president's brain. You see, that brain, according to the doctors, had been blown partially away. Only problem? In order to see that brain that had been set aside for the archives, well, can't see that brain, my friend, because the president's brain, get this, it went missing. Yeah, you heard me right. It's missing. The president's brain, missing, lost. How do you do that? How do you hide a brain? Unless you really are trying to hide something. And on that first commission, well, the Warren Commission, there was another guy there that you well know. His name was Gerald Ford. He became our president after Nixon. And President Ford himself, who served on the Warren Commission, well, he himself was reported as later telling French president, well, President Kennedy was not killed by a lone gunman, that it was indeed a conspiracy, even though President Ford had served on the Warren Commission that said it was not. And the autopsy, even itself, was a sham. It was conducted by 2 naval pathologists. And these guys had never had any experience with autopsies dealing with gunshot wounds. Now, don't you think that in this investigation it would be important to know how to deal with gunshot wounds? There were like 7 or 8 of them. They tried to explain one of them with, or 7 of them with a magic bullet that did some incredible stuff. Now, this autopsy was actually conducted by these inexperienced pathologists, even though there were very, very, very many experienced experts that could have been available to perform that autopsy. And by law, the autopsy should have been performed in Texas. And there was an able-bodied expert ready to do that. But the Secret Service, well, they whisked the body away. So, all this public outcry now and unanswered questions of the Warren report, well, it brought about another hearing, years later, by the Senate Committee on Assassinations. And that committee stated that there is probable cause to believe that the killing of the president, well, it was indeed a conspiracy, not the act of a lone gunman. So, let me ask you, if it was a conspiracy, who was involved? We already know that the mob is one group who had a motive, means, and an opportunity. There are 3 main mob bosses that do emerge as suspects in this theory. One is Giuliani. He was out of Chicago. Trafficante, he was out of Miami, and Marcello out of Louisiana. In fact, Trafficante, well, he was expelled from Mexico. You see, he had kind of skipped the country when the heat was on. Went down to Mexico to live, but there, Mexico, well, they decided to expel him. And when he got back to America, he was called to testify about his knowledge of such events. But get this, he was amazingly gunned down, shot, and killed in his home before he could appear before that hearing. And not long after a reported wiretap of the other 2 mob bosses that we mentioned, they were talking, and they reportedly picked up a conversation between these 2 mob bosses. And they said these words, quote, "Only 3 people really know how the president was killed. One is dead." They're talking to each other, and they said, well, we're not talking. Now, prior to that, there was a report at a meeting of the mob, and the killing of the president was discussed. And the statement was reportedly made, quote, "If you're going to kill a dog, you do not cut off its tail. You cut off its head." Meaning to silence the Kennedys. Well, if you're going to silence the Kennedys and keep them from going after Hoffa and the mob, you take out the president. See, he was the head. Now, this statement happened to also be a Sicilian statement, one that mob bosses are very, very familiar with. Now, just last week, we brought you information regarding the killing of Hoffa. We introduced information that one theory was that he was killed by Frank Sheeran, and how this was revealed in the movie The Irishman, and that came from the book I Paint Houses. But what I did not tell you last week, that excluded from the movie, but very much covered in the book, was Frank Sheeran telling how he was instrumental, now get this, in delivering rifles that were used in Texas in the shooting of President Kennedy. So if you do believe that Frank Sharon and his account of how Hoffa was killed, well, you're just as likely to believe that he was also involved in delivering the weapons that were used to shoot President Kennedy. Now, you may be saying, well, how does this really tie in Jimmy Hoffa? How does this tie in Jimmy Hoffa with the killing of President Kennedy? Well, that's a good question. You see, according to the 1994 book written by attorney Frank Regano, who, by the way, represented Hoffa, well, according to him in this book, the Teamster leader Hoffa, he asked mob bosses Santos Trafficani and Carlos Marcello to arrange the assassination of President Kennedy. You see, Marcello would be the mob boss that would control Dallas as well. And get this, now Jack Ruby who killed Lee Oswald on national television in front of thousands of people and dozens of cops, well, Jack Ruby, he was knee-deep in the mob. Now, Regano also claims that on the day that the president was killed, Ruby joined Trafficante in a toast. Now, Regano also recalls the dying Trafficante confessing in 1987 to having a role in the killing of the president. Though he does say that the mob boss eventually said that he came to regret not killing Robert instead of his brother, John F. Kennedy. So there you have it, the tie-in. The tie-in with Hoffa and the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, the bottom line is this. Because the first investigation was so biased and blotched, it greatly hindered the pursuit of the truth in the investigation of the president's killing. There's not a doubt in my mind that there was a cover-up. But why? Was it to cover up who killed the president? Or was it to cover up the fact that Oswald had definite connections to the CIA and he was well known to the FBI before this incident? Or was it to cover up the CIA ties to the mob with a plot to assassinate Castro? And let me ask you, did this lead investigators away from really investigating the mob's involvement in the killing of the president? Well, there's no doubt whatsoever this investigation was tainted from the very beginning. Next, there's just no way I'm convinced that the shooting was done by one man. Yep, he was a patsy. There were others involved. It was a conspiracy. The only question is, who was involved in the conspiracy? Was it a foreign power? Was it Castro? Was it the CIA? Was it the mob? Well, that's what I'm going to let you decide, and let me know how you feel. I'd love for you to shout out to me. Shout out to me by going to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Tell me what you think about Hoffa and the assassination of the president. Or just reach out to give us a shout out and say hi. charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. To everybody that reaches out, we'll get back to you and we'll send you a gift of appreciation. And hey, by the way, do take time to join us by becoming a badge supporter of our real heroes who lay down their life on the line. Go to peacemakernetwork.com, peacemakernetwork.com. Be a part of not just saying you support these heroes, but actually doing something about it. Law enforcement, other heroes deserve our support. So until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster here, urging you, be safe, be alert. For the life you save, yep, it may be your very own.